No one touches my daughter when I'm not here, especially not you, Maria Williams froze, kneeling beside the porcelain tub. She had just rinsed the last traces of soap from little Sonia's curls. The 2-year-old giggled, her tiny hands patting the warm water. Maria smiled until that voice rang out. The deep, cold voice of Graham Wittman struck her like a slap. Maria's hand trembled in midair. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would tear through her chest. For a moment she couldn't breathe. He was home, but he wasn't supposed to be here at this hour. Maria's mind spun. She had only meant to bring Sonia upstairs to help the child cool down. Sonia was sweating, fussy, cheeks flushed, her skin a little warm, maybe a mild fever. The nanny had gone home early. There was no one else here. Maria couldn't bear to see the child uncomfortable, so she had prepared a small bath. Warm enough, safe enough for her. But now, seeing this, what would Sonia's father, her billionaire employer, think? How was she supposed to explain this? Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now, let's return to the story. Imagine this perpendicular. You're standing in a house so grand it feels cold. All marble and echoes, where every step sounds like a verdict. The air is thick with wealth, but it's a lonely weight, like a stone nobody ever wanted. A man, Graham Wittman, strides through the front door, his suit sharp as a blade, his heart tangled between grief. He's a billionaire, yes. But that's just a word that can't hold his daughter when she cries or fill the silence his late wife left behind. He came home early, unannounced, expecting order, routine, the quiet hum of a life he's paid to keep steady. But what he finds stops him cold. A young black woman, Maria Williams, kneeling by a porcelain tub, rinsing soap from his daughter Sonia's curls. The child giggles, splashing water, her tiny hands clapping in joy. Maria hums softly, her voice like a stream over stones, but Graham's voice slices through the air. Cold as winter wind bitteralt, no one touches my daughter when I'm not here. Especially not you. The room shrinks beneath that sound. Maria freezes, her hand trembling midair, soap dripping to the floor. Her heart pounds like a drum, beating out fear and something deeper. Almost shame, though she's done nothing wrong. Sonia, only 2, looks up, her laughter fading, sensing the storm in her father's eyes. Graham's footsteps thunder up the stairs, each one a verdict, and Maria rises quickly, wrapping Sonia in a towel, holding her with a care that's more than duty. Mr. Wittman, she begins, but he's already there, a thundercloud in a tailored suit, fists clenched, eyes blazing. What the hell do you think you're doing with my daughter? He roars. Sonia whimpers, startled, and Maria clutches her tighter, instinct overriding fear. She had a fever, Maria says, her voice trembling but steady in its truth. I was only trying to cool her down. The nanny left early. I didn't want her to suffer. Graham doesn't hear her. Not really. His mind's a wildfire, burning through reason, seeing only a stranger with his child. A child he swore to protect the day Maria, her mother, died. He steps forward, yanks Sonia from Maria's arms, and the girl shrieks, her tiny body trembling. Daddy, she cries, clinging to his jacket, water dripping down her arms. You're not her mother, he snaps at Maria. You're an employee, you clean. You don't touch my child. Maria's eyes drop, her breath catching, but she doesn't flinch. She was calling for help, she says softly. She needed someone. Graham's jaw tightens, his knuckles white around Sonia's towel. Get your things. You're done here. You feel it, don't you? That moment when fear and love collide, when a man's heart, torn by loss, lashes out at what he doesn't understand. Maria looks at Sonia, sobbing in her father's arms, and whispers, "Please, let me calm her." But Graham's already turning away, his anger a wall no words can breach. Maria nods once, silent, and walks downstairs. She packs her bag without a word, folding her damp blue dress with care, the one Sonia had leaned against. Frank, the old house manager, meets her at the door. "You okay?" he asks, his voice soft as worn leather. "I just wanted her to feel better," Maria says, her words fragile but true. He gives her a long look, one that sees more than most. "That's why he's angry," he says. "You did what he couldn't." The grandfather clock ticks in the hallway, steady as a heartbeat, while Graham sits in his study, Sonia curled in his lap, wrapped in a dry blanket. She's cried herself to sleep, her body still trembling, and he's whispering reassurances she can't hear, his heart still racing, no longer from anger but from a confusion that gnaws like hunger. He'd walked into something raw, intimate, a moment that woke a primal fear. Maria, with her quiet eyes and gentle hands, had crossed a line he didn't even know he'd drawn. But now, with Sonia's breath uneven against him, he's haunted by her cry when he took her away. It wasn't for him, not like it used to be. She reached for Maria, her tiny fists trembling, and that cry, gut deep, was one he hadn't heard since Maria died. Schupever sleeping men huntered lash. It meant loss. Frank knocks softly at the door. "Sir?" Graham looks up. "She's sleeping," he says quietly. Frank steps inside, hands folded. "Permission to speak freely?" Graham nods, wary. "You were wrong to send Maria away," Frank says plain. "She was bathing my daughter without permission." Graham snaps. "That's over the line." Frank doesn't back down. Sometimes lines get crossed for good reasons. Sonia calls her Mama Maria. "You didn't hear it, cause you were shouting." "I did." Graham tightens. He sees Sonia's tiny hand twitching in sleep and hears her cry again. "Don't let go." He looks at Frank. "Why didn't the nanny stay?" he asks. "Family emergency," Frank says. Maria stepped in because she saw the need. Nobody forced her. You know that feeling when the ground shifts under you, when what you thought was solid turns to sand. Graham's in that place now, his instincts warring with reason. He's Sonia's father, the one who's supposed to know her best, but he's staring at a truth he can't dodge. Maria gave her something he didn't. He closes his eyes, guilt seeping in like rain through a cracked roof. Maria's laughter echoes in his memory, reading to Sonia, filling this house with warmth. Maria brought that back, not the same, but close enough to hurt. "You think I should have thanked her?" he asks Frank, sharper than he means. "I think you should have asked why she did it, for deciding what it meant," Frank says, then leaves without another word. Graham sits there, Sonia's breath soft against him, and wonders what you do when you've pushed away the one person who saw what you couldn't. The house grows dim, the light fading outside, and he doesn't call the agency. He doesn't call Maria back either. But in the guest bathroom where it all happened, he kneels by the tub. Still damp, a yellow duck floating in leftover water. And for the first time he feels the weight of being alone, not just without Maria, but without the courage to trust again. Graham sat in the study, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling lazily inside the crystal. He didn't drink often, but tonight it seemed the only thing that might steady the trembling in his chest. He had sent Maria away, dismissed her like some kind of temporary figure in the landscape of his life. And yet the weight of her absence pressed down on him with an intensity he couldn't shake. His daughter Sonia had gone to bed crying for Maria, her small body curled up in the center of her bed, seeking a comfort that wasn't there. He tried to tell himself that what he had done was right, that it had been necessary to keep boundaries, to protect the sanctity of his family, to protect the image of his life, the one he had so carefully crafted. But deep down he knew better. It wasn't the boundary that he feared. It was the vulnerability. The vulnerability of allowing someone into his life so fully, so intimately, that they could touch the places he had locked away for years. It terrified him, the idea that he might need someone, that he might have to let go of the control he had so painstakingly maintained. And so he drank. He tried to forget, but the taste of whiskey in his mouth only seemed to make the bitterness in his chest worse. Downstairs, the house felt empty, the kind of empty that echoes. The soft tick of the grandfather clock was the only sound that filled the silence. The house, with all its polished floors, its perfectly arranged furniture, its expensive walls, felt cold and inhospitable now. It was a shell, a place where people could live but never really feel alive. And Graham had allowed it to become that way, convinced that the comfort of wealth and status could substitute for something deeper. As he stared into the glass, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs caught his attention. His pulse quickened, but it was only Frank, the house manager, who had come to check on things, to make sure that the night had settled down. Graham had barely spoken to him since the confrontation with Maria, but Frank's presence was a welcome, if silent, comfort. The man had seen it all, the turmoil of the company, the scandals, the losses, and yet he had remained steady, like the rock that sat at the bottom of the stream, unmoving no matter the current. "Sir," Frank said quietly, standing in the doorway. His eyes flicked to the glass in Graham's hand, then back to him. "Everything all right?" Graham sighed and set the glass down. He didn't answer immediately, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. Frank didn't press him. He knew better than to rush Graham in moments like this. Instead, he moved into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he knew this was a conversation that needed to be given time to unfold, not forced out in a rush. "I shouldn't have sent her away," Graham muttered, more to himself than to Frank. The words felt foreign in his mouth, as if they had been buried beneath years of pride and self-preservation. But they were true, and saying them, admitting the mistake, felt like the first step towards something he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Frank stood silently waiting. He had known Graham for years, long before Maria had passed, long before the company had grown into the behemoth it was now. He knew Graham's pride, knew how it had shaped him into the man he was today, and he knew how that same pride had kept him isolated, at a distance from the people who mattered most. Frank's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "You've always been a man who holds his cards close, Graham. But sometimes you need to let go of the hand you're holding and see what's right in front of you." Graham swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if Frank was talking about the company, about Maria, or about the life he had built. But somehow it all felt like the same thing. "I don't know how to do this," Graham said, the vulnerability creeping into his voice, uninvited but undeniable. "I don't know how to let her in. I don't know how to trust someone with this. This life we've built." Frank nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Graham's face. "It's not about trust, sir. It's about understanding. Understanding that some things, some people, are worth letting into the spaces you've guarded so long. You don't have to let go of everything, just the parts that need healing." Graham closed his eyes, the weight of those words sinking into his chest. He had spent so long hiding behind walls, behind wealth, behind power, that he had forgotten what it felt like to let someone in, to let someone see him, not the billionaire, not the father, not the man who had everything, no, but the man who had been hurt, the man who had loved and lost, the man who was just trying to figure it all out. Frank didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Graham had heard him, felt the truth of his words resonate deep within him. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, heavy with understanding. And for the first time in years, Graham allowed himself to feel the weight of the loss, the grief, the love that he had buried so deep inside. "I've been afraid," Graham admitted, his voice low. "Afraid of what might happen if I let anyone see what's beneath all of this. Afraid of losing everything." Frank's expression softened, but he didn't offer any reassurance. Instead, he simply nodded and turned to leave. "It's a hard thing to let go, but sometimes, Graham, it's the only way forward." The door clicked shut behind Frank, and Graham sat in the study alone, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the trees in the garden, the sound of the leaves swirling in the cold night air. But inside, in the quiet of his home, Graham was finally facing the truth he had been avoiding. He had built his life on control, on keeping everything just so, on maintaining the perfect image. But now, for the first time, he was realizing that control wasn't enough, not anymore. Maria had shown him something that night, something he hadn't expected, something he wasn't ready for. But now, as he sat there in the stillness of his study, he understood. He understood that what he had with Maria was real, and it was worth protecting. Not because of who she was, but because of what she had given his daughter. And in turn, what she had given him, a chance to stop hiding, to stop pretending, to start living again. Graham woke the next morning to a house that felt almost unnervingly quiet. The silence seemed to have settled deeper into the rooms, creeping into every corner, making the space feel like a hollow shell. He had spent most of the night pacing, unable to quiet the thoughts swirling in his mind. The darkness had been long, stretching endlessly before him, filled with the echoes of everything he had pushed aside for years. Sonia was still asleep upstairs. He hadn't seen her much after the incident with Maria, and the guilt gnawed at him. He had pulled away from her, retreating into the safety of his own anger, his own confusion, and his own pride. She had called for Maria, had cried for the woman who had cared for her, the woman who had given her the warmth and love that he, as her father, should have been giving her. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the fog of exhaustion. He couldn't avoid it anymore. He needed to face what he had done, what he had allowed to happen. And, most importantly, he needed to figure out what to do next. As he stood by the kitchen counter, the smell of coffee filled the air. Frank had already gone to check on the estate's perimeter, as he always did first thing in the morning. But Graham found no comfort in the routine. He needed something more than routine now. He needed change. He needed to face the fear that had kept him locked inside his gilded cage. The phone buzzed on the countertop, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from the agency. The words were brief, the tone polite but distant. "Brian Durant, we regret to inform you that we are ending the contract with Ms. Maria Williams due to a violation of company policy regarding employee conduct." Graham felt his stomach lurch as he read it again. His jaw tightened. He stared at the screen, unable to make sense of it. Maria had not done anything wrong. She had been the one who had protected Sonia when he couldn't. She had been the one who had shown more heart than he had ever thought to expect. And now this, an official dismissal from the very agency that had promised to keep his home in order, to keep his life safe from disruption. The irony was not lost on him. He threw the phone down on the counter with a sharp motion, frustration rising like a tide inside of him. His mind was racing. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. He'd already lost his wife. He couldn't lose Maria, too. As if summoned by his thoughts, the door to the study opened, and Maria walked in, her movements quiet but deliberate, as always. She held a tray of tea in her hands, her face expressionless, though he could see the slight tightness in her jaw, the tension in her shoulders. "Graham," she said softly, her voice low, almost hesitant, "you need to see this." She set the tray down on the table, but he barely noticed it. His gaze was fixed on her face, her eyes that had held so much calm, so much understanding, and yet right now they were filled with something else. Hurt, disappointment, fear, what is it? He asked, his voice rough, his throat suddenly dry. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter, holding it out to him. It was the same one he had just read, but somehow it felt different when she handed it to him. It was as if she was offering him her own vulnerability in that moment. The vulnerability of a woman who had already given so much, only to be discarded as though she had never mattered. "I saw this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's from the agency. I was hoping you would handle it." Graham took the letter from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the softness, the care. He could feel it like a knot tightening in his chest. "Who sent this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The agency," she replied, her eyes not quite meeting his. He knew. "You were there for her," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "You've always been there for her." "I don't know what I was thinking." Maria didn't respond immediately. She just stood there, watching him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "Graham, I don't need anyone to fight for me," she said softly. "I've learned how to survive on my own. I don't expect you to fight my battles." His eyes widened, the weight of her words sinking in. "You've always fought on your own, haven't you?" he asked, his voice raw. "But why? Why didn't you ever let me see you? Let me help you?" They've made their decision. It's done." Graham stood up quickly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You didn't. This isn't." He trailed off, unable to find the words. "I didn't do anything wrong," she finished for him, her voice steady but tired. She didn't need to say anything more. Maria's eyes softened, but she still didn't look directly at him. "Because I didn't know if you ever would. And I was afraid you wouldn't understand. Afraid that the moment I let you in, you'd see me as something I'm not. Someone I'm not." Graham moved closer to her, his heart pounding. "But you're so much more than that. So much more than this label they've given you, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix all the things I've broken, but I want to try." She turned to face him, her gaze now steady and searching. "Try?" she asked softly. "How?" "By seeing you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as the maid, not as the help, but as the woman who's been holding this house together. The woman who's been holding me together." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment they just stood there, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Finally Maria nodded slowly. "Then start by seeing Sonia," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She's the one who needs you most. And she's the one who needs to see you, see her." Graham swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. He knew what he needed to do. He had spent so much time looking for answers outside of himself that he had forgotten to look where it truly mattered. And now he had a chance to make it right. He reached out, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from Maria's face. "I won't let them take you away," he promised. "I won't let them take her away. Not again." She smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it, only a quiet understanding. "It's not about them," she said softly. "It's about us and what we choose to build." And in that moment, for the first time in years, Graham felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the first step, but it was the beginning of something. Something that had the potential to be real, to be lasting, to be more than just survival. Graham stood in the doorway, staring out at the quiet morning light that filtered through the windows of the study. The stillness of the house pressed in around him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had made the right decision. But the longer he stood there, the more he realized that it wasn't about the decision itself. It was about what came after, about the commitment to make something real out of the wreckage of the past. His thoughts drifted back to Maria, to the way she had stood in front of him, not pleading, not begging for forgiveness, but simply asking for something he had long since forgotten to offer. In that moment, he realized how much he had allowed his pride to shape everything in his life, how much he had hidden behind walls that he himself had built. And now those walls were crumbling bit by bit, and he wasn't sure whether to be afraid or relieved. He turned back to face the room, his gaze falling on the stacks of papers on his desk. The contracts, the numbers, the reminders of everything that had once seemed so important. But today none of it mattered. None of it felt like the same weight it once had. All that mattered now was the woman in his life, Maria, and the daughter he had been neglecting. The sound of little feet padding down the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Graham's heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open and Sonia appeared. Her hair messy from sleep, her little face illuminated by the soft glow of the morning light. She rubbed her eyes sleepily and then looked up at him, her small hands clutching her stuffed bunny tightly against her chest. "Daddy," she said, her voice small but steady, the way it always was when she woke up from a peaceful sleep. Graham crouched down, his heart aching as he looked at her, his little girl. The warmth of her presence was enough to shake him to his core, to remind him of everything he had almost lost, everything he had taken for granted. He reached out, pulling her into his arms, the way he used to do, the way he had been doing before all of this, before he had lost himself in the business, in the grief, in the endless cycle of living up to expectations that weren't his own. "Good morning, sweetheart," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. Her soft curls tickled his cheek, and for a moment he forgot about the rest of the world. In her arms he felt whole again. "Maria's still here, right?" she asked, her little voice trembling slightly. "Oh," her eyes wide with the uncertainty of a child who had been through too many changes. Graham's heart clenched. He had been so focused on his own struggles, on the fear of what it meant to let Maria in, that he hadn't stopped to think about what this had all done to his daughter. To Sonia, Maria had become something more than just the person who worked in the house. She had become a source of comfort, of safety, of love, and Graham had almost taken that away. He nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetie, Maria's still here." Sonia smiled, a soft, relieved expression crossing her face as she nestled closer into his arms. Graham held her for a long moment, letting the weight of the past few days settle into the space between them. He hadn't been the father he should have been, the one Sonia needed, but he was determined to change that. "Maria's always here for me," Sonia said softly, almost as if she were trying to reassure him, trying to remind him of something he had forgotten. Graham swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "She is," he whispered, "and I'm here too. Always." He stood up, holding Sonia tightly against him, and walked with her down the hallway, through the house that had once felt so cold and sterile, but now felt a little warmer. As he passed by the study, he saw Maria standing in the doorway, her gaze falling on him, her eyes soft and steady. There was no judgment in her eyes, no anger, no sense of being wronged. There was only understanding. She knew what he was struggling with, what he had been trying to hide, but she also knew that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, about being present, about trying, even when you didn't know if you had the strength to do it. Maria smiled faintly as Graham walked toward her, Sonia nestled in his arms. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that they would work through this, together. "How is she?" Maria asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Graham looked down at his daughter, her tiny hands resting against his shoulder, her eyes already beginning to flutter shut again, the peace of sleep settling over her once more. "She's good," he said quietly. "She's okay." Maria nodded, her gaze shifting between him and Sonia. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I'm glad she's okay." Graham didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words everything that had happened in the last Arthur-Seif hours, but in that moment he realized that words weren't necessary. Maria had been the one who had shown him how to let go, how to face his own fears, how to love without reservation. And now, for the first time in a long time, he understood that he didn't have to do it all alone. He stepped forward, carefully placing Sonia in Maria's arms, his hands lingering on the child's back as he looked up at Maria. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for everything." Maria smiled gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from Sonia's forehead as she adjusted the little girl in her arms. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "I'm just here for both of you." And in that moment, Graham knew. He knew that Maria was more than just someone who had come into his life to care for his daughter. She was the missing piece, the part of the puzzle he had never realized he needed. She had shown him that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to need someone, to ask for help. As he stood there, watching the two of them together, a strange sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't the peace he had been searching for in his wealth or his success. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from keeping everything under control. It was the kind of peace that came from letting go, from trusting, from allowing someone to see the parts of you that you had been hiding. And for the first time in years, Graham realized that this moment, this feeling, this family, was enough. He didn't need anything else. The next morning, the sun poured through the wide windows of the Watson estate, casting long shadows across. The house, usually quiet and solitary, felt different today. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a shift, as if something was unfolding in the spaces between the walls. Graham stood in the kitchen, watching Maria as she worked, her movements fluid and natural. He could see how comfortable she had become in this space, how she had made it her own in small, unspoken ways. It wasn't just the meals she prepared or the way she spoke to Sonia. It was the way she carried herself, the way she moved through the house, as if it belonged to her just as much as it did to him. Sonia was at the table, her tiny hand spread out over the paper in front of her, crayons in hand. She was drawing something, though Graham couldn't make out what it was. Her concentration was absolute, her brows furrowed in that way only children could manage, as if the world around her had stopped just for a moment, leaving her with nothing but her art. It struck him again how much she had changed in such a short time, how much had changed in his life. A few weeks ago, this house had been nothing more than a collection of rooms filled with expensive furniture and untouched memories. Now it was something more, a home, and Maria was at the center of it. She glanced up from the stove, catching his gaze for just a second, her eyes soft but steady. There was something in the way she looked at him that made the air between them feel lighter, as if the tension that had hung there for so long was slowly dissipating. "You're thinking too loud," Maria said, her voice gentle, but with an edge of amusement. Graham blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't realized how much he'd been lost in thought. "I was just thinking about how much things have changed," he said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. She didn't say anything at first. She simply turned back to her work, stirring something in the pot, her face serene. But the words hung in the air between them, unspoken but felt. There was so much he hadn't expected, so much he hadn't planned for. He had built this life, this world, brick by brick, convinced that it would protect him from everything. But now, standing here, watching Maria move around his kitchen, watching Sonia laugh and play, he realized how empty that world had been before. How much it had lacked. "I'm not sure what's more surprising," Graham continued, his voice coming a little easier now. "How quickly you've become a part of this, or how easily I've let you in." Maria paused for a moment, her back still turned to him, but her shoulders tensing slightly, just enough for him to notice. She didn't answer right away, and for a brief moment, Graham wondered if she would. But then, just as he thought she might remain silent, she spoke. "You don't have to apologize for that, Graham. You don't have to explain yourself." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The unspoken understanding between them was heavy, and for the first time, Graham felt the full weight of it settle into his chest. He wasn't just letting her in, he was letting himself out. He was letting himself feel again, and it terrified him more than he cared to admit. "I'm not apologizing," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm just realizing how much I've missed, how much I've overlooked in my pursuit of safety." Maria turned slightly, just enough for him to see the corner of her mouth quirk upward. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but it was something else, something softer. She didn't say anything more. She simply returned to her task, but the air between them had changed. It was different now, lighter, more open. Sonia stood up from the table then, holding up her crayon masterpiece to show Maria. The little girl's eyes sparkled with excitement, her pride evident in the way she grinned, barely showing beneath her lips. "Look, Maria, look at my rainbow," she exclaimed, holding up the picture with both hands. Maria crouched down to her level, her eyes widening in exaggerated admiration. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm, like the sun. "You've made the prettiest rainbow I've ever seen," Sonia beamed, her little body practically glowing with joy. It was a simple moment, but it was the kind of moment that Graham had forgotten to appreciate for so long. The kind of moment that couldn't be bought or controlled. The kind of moment that filled the empty spaces in his life without asking for anything in return. For a brief moment, as he watched Maria and Sonia together, something inside of Graham shifted again. The walls that had been so carefully constructed, so solid and unyielding, began to crumble, piece by piece. It wasn't about letting go, not exactly. It was more about learning how to embrace what he had, to embrace the people who had become his world, even if it meant letting them see him, truly see him, for the first time. "Do you think we could make more rainbows?" Sonia asked, her voice hopeful, filled with the innocence of a child who had yet to learn that some things in life didn't always work out the way you planned. "I think we can," Maria said, standing up again and brushing off her knees. "We can make the biggest rainbow ever." Sonia's face lit up at the thought, her eyes wide with excitement. "Yes, a big rainbow, like the one in the sky." Graham couldn't help but smile, the warmth of the moment flooding through him. He wasn't sure what had changed exactly, but something had. He had spent so much of his life trying to keep everything neat and in order, trying to control the narrative, trying to be the man who always had the answers. But here, in this moment with Maria and Sonia, he realized that there was more to life than control. There was beauty in the chaos, in the unpredictability. There was freedom in letting go and trusting that the people who mattered most would be there, no matter what. He walked over to them, his steps slow but purposeful. "How about we all make a rainbow together?" he suggested, his voice lighter than it had been in a long time. Sonia squealed in delight, her small hands clapping. "Yes! Yes, let's make the biggest one ever." Maria glanced up at him, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. A spark of understanding, perhaps. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Graham felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling, like the tension that had gripped the Watson estate for so long was finally beginning to loosen. The house, once cold and imposing, was becoming something else. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was real. The walls had started to hum with the rhythm of life, of Sonia's laughter, of Maria's quiet presence, of Graham's tentative steps toward a new kind of life, a life he wasn't sure he knew how to live, but one he was willing to try. Maria had settled into her role in the house, not as a servant or as an employee, but as something more, something Graham couldn't quite define. She had become the steady hand in the chaos, the calm in the storm. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply gave. She gave to Sonia, she gave to him, and, in some strange way, she gave to herself, too. It wasn't the kind of giving that demanded recognition or thanks. It was the kind that came from a place of deep understanding, the kind of giving that could only come from someone who had known pain and had learned how to turn it into something beautiful. Graham found himself watching her more often than he had before. The way she moved through the house, her presence quiet, but she had a way of filling a room without ever making it feel crowded, of making space for everyone while still holding on to herself. It was something he admired, something he wanted to understand. But every time he tried to dig deeper, to ask her about her past, to learn more about the woman behind the calm exterior, she would slip away, her answers vague and noncommittal. He wasn't sure why it bothered him. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he had opened himself up to the idea of being seen, of being vulnerable, and yet there were parts of Maria that still remained locked away. He didn't need to know everything about her past, he reminded himself. But part of him still wanted to understand, wanted to know what made her tick, what had shaped her into the woman who could give so much without asking for anything in return. One evening, after dinner, Graham found himself in the study again, staring at the same paperwork he had been avoiding for days. His mind wasn't on the contracts or the reports or the endless emails. It was on Maria, on the way she had looked at him earlier that day, her eyes soft but distant, as if there was something she was holding back. He knew she didn't want to talk about it, not yet at least, but it gnawed at him. He could feel the distance between them, the wall she had built around herself, and he wasn't sure how to break it down. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Maria standing in the doorway, her posture relaxed, her hands folded in front of her. She had that same quiet grace about her, that same calm that seemed to fill the space around her without effort. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Graham nodded, setting aside the papers. "Of course." "What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, closing the door gently behind her. There was something in her eyes, something that made Graham's heart tighten. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't just about the house or the family, or the things that had been left unsaid for so long. There was something deeper, something personal that she was finally ready to confront. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maria began, her voice steady but filled with a kind of quiet determination. "About trust, about letting go." Graham leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. He could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air between them. "And I think I've been hiding for so long, hiding from everything, from myself, from the world, from you." She paused, her fingers brushing against the edge of the chair. "I've spent my whole life running from my past, running from the things I thought would break me. But maybe I don't have to keep running anymore." Graham's heart skipped a beat. There was something in her words, something vulnerable that made him want to reach out, to pull her closer, to make her understand that she didn't have to hide anymore, not from him, not from anyone. But he knew he couldn't do that, not yet. "I don't want to run anymore," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I want to be here. With you. With Sonia. But there are things I need to say, things I need to face before I can truly be here." Graham stood up, walking over to where she stood. He didn't speak at first, just reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm. The touch light but filled with meaning. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to," he said softly. "You've already given us more than I could ever ask for." Maria looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a kind of sadness he hadn't seen before. "It's not about what I've given you, Graham. It's about what I've been holding back, and I can't keep holding it anymore. Not with you." Graham's heart raced as he felt the weight of her words sink in. He wanted to say something, wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything was going to be okay. But he knew better than to make empty promises. He didn't have all the answers, and neither did she. But what he did know was that they were here, together, and that was enough for now. "I'm here," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Whenever you're ready, I'm here." Maria smiled faintly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it meant more than words could say. She took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I'll be ready," she whispered, "soon." And for the first time, Graham felt a sense of peace wash over him. Not the kind of peace that came from control or success, but the kind that came from letting go, from allowing someone else to be a part of his world without fear or hesitation. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, he was no longer alone. The days following that conversation with Maria were filled with a strange kind of quiet. The house had returned to its rhythms, but everything felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a new energy that hummed beneath the surface, making the very walls of the Watson estate seem more alive, more human, free. Maria had stepped into a role that was no longer defined by the walls of her past, but by the bond she was forging with Graham and Sonia. She no longer moved through the house as an outsider, but as a part of it, as a heartbeat that matched the rhythm of their lives. Graham had spent the past few days thinking about everything, about the way things had unfolded since Maria had entered their lives. He hadn't been prepared for the effect she would have on him, on his daughter. He hadn't expected to feel the way he did when he saw her with Sonia. The tenderness she showed without hesitation, the love she gave without condition. It had unsettled him, forced him to confront the things he had buried deep inside himself. The fears and doubts that had kept him locked in the safety of his own solitude. And then there was the issue of his mother, Emilia, Her words still echoed in his mind, her disapproving tone lingering like a shadow over everything he did. He hadn't spoken to her since their last conversation, but he knew it wouldn't be long before she made her next move. Emilia had always been a force in his life, always in control, always pushing him to conform to the image she had carefully crafted for him. But this time he wasn't so sure he cared what she thought. He sat in the study, his hands folded in front of him, staring at the paperwork he had been avoiding for days. He wasn't thinking about the contracts or the financials. His thoughts kept drifting to Maria, to Sonia, to the future. He couldn't deny the way he felt about her, the way she had made him see the world differently. It wasn't just about what she had done for Sonia. It was about what she had done for him. She had opened a door he hadn't even known was there, a door that led to something more than the empty promises of success and wealth. She had shown him what it meant to truly live. The door to the study creaked open, and Graham looked up to see Maria standing in the doorway. Her presence was calm, like a quiet storm rolling in, something steady and sure, but with the power to change everything. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, Graham felt something shift again, a pull in the air between them. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, concerned. Graham nodded slowly, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. "Just thinking," he said, his voice distant. "About everything." Maria stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She moved with the same quiet grace he had grown accustomed to, her every step measured, as though she was aware of the weight of the world around her, yet didn't let it crush her. She paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on him, before speaking again. "I know you've been carrying a lot," she said, her voice almost like a whisper. "You don't have to do it alone, you know, not anymore." Graham's chest tightened at her words. He had tried so hard to keep everything together, to hold it all in, to make sure that no one saw the cracks in the facade he had built. But Maria was right, he didn't have to do it alone. Not anymore. "I don't know what to do with all of it," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix it all." Maria moved closer, her presence grounding him, and for a moment he felt the tension in his body ease. She reached out and placed a hand on his, the touch light, but steady. It was a simple gesture, but it was all he needed. In that moment he didn't need answers. He just needed to be seen, to be understood. "You don't have to fix everything, Graham," she said gently. "Sometimes the fixing happens when we stop trying to control everything, when we let go and let things unfold." Her words resonated deeply within him. He had spent so much time trying to control the narrative of his life, trying to steer it in a direction that made sense, that was safe. But maybe safety wasn't the answer. Maybe it was about finding peace in the chaos, finding comfort in the uncertainty. "I don't know how to stop controlling everything," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so long trying to make sure nothing slips through my fingers. But it feels like everything's slipping away anyway." Maria smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "The more we try to hold on to things, the more we push them away. Sometimes it's about letting go, letting things happen as they will. And when we do that, we give ourselves the space to grow." Graham's heart swelled at her words. He had always thought that control was the answer, that the more he could manage, the safer he would be, but Maria was showing him something different. She was showing him that life wasn't about control. It was about connection, about being present, about letting the pieces fall where they may. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, his gaze meeting hers. "But I know I want to try to face it with you, with Sonia. Maria's smile widened, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We don't have to have all the answers, Graham. We just have to take it one step at a time." Graham nodded, a sense of clarity settling over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. He didn't have to have everything figured out. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be there, for Maria, for Sonia, for himself. As they stood there, in the quiet of the study, the weight of everything that had passed seemed to lift, if only for a moment. They weren't finished yet, not by a long shot, but they were beginning to build something real. Something that didn't rely on control, on appearances, on the expectations of others. It was something built on trust, on love, on acceptance. And for the first time, Graham felt like he had finally found a path forward. A path that wasn't paved with fear and doubt, but with hope. The next few days passed in a rhythm that was new to Graham, one that he found both comforting and unsettling. The house seemed to breathe differently, as though it was alive with the changes taking place inside it. Maria was no longer just a part of the household routine. She was at its center, quietly shifting the way things had always been done, without demanding recognition, without asking for permission. It was a quiet revolution, but it was one that was taking root deep in the soil of their lives. Sonia had begun to cling to her more than ever. It wasn't the kind of cling that came from fear or insecurity, but from a deeper, quieter place. It was as if Maria had become the anchor in her world, the one steady thing she could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. And that, in turn, seemed to calm Graham in ways he hadn't expected. He had feared that Maria's presence in their lives would disrupt the fragile equilibrium he had fought so hard to maintain. It was doing the opposite. It was filling in the cracks. It was allowing him to be a better father, a better man. Still, there were moments when the weight of the past hung heavy in the air, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. Graham had avoided his mother's calls for days. He knew what she would say, the disapproval, the warnings, the pressure to maintain the image that had been so carefully constructed over the years. He wasn't ready to face her yet, not while he was still trying to figure out what kind of man he was becoming. On the morning that the first storm of autumn rolled in, Graham stood at the window of his study, watching the dark clouds gather over the estate. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches with a force that felt almost violent. He could hear the rain begin to drum against the windows, the sound of it steady and insistent like a heartbeat. Maria appeared behind him, her footsteps soft but sure. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He could feel her presence, feel the warmth she brought with her even on a day like this. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside him. The quiet turmoil that had been building since that night he had sat with her in the kitchen, pouring out his thoughts, his fears. The words had been raw, unrefined, but they had been the beginning of something real. She didn't speak at first, just stood there watching him. Bosh, it was as if she knew he needed time, needed space to process whatever it was that was weighing him down. He couldn't look at her just yet. He wasn't ready to open up completely, to let go of the last of the control he had so carefully cultivated. But he could feel her steady gaze on his back, and that was enough. Finally he turned, meeting her eyes. There was nothing in them but understanding. Nothing in her face that said she expected answers, that said she needed him to be something he wasn't ready to be. She simply waited, like she always did, for him to come to her in his own time. "I've been thinking," Graham began, his voice low, rough from the weight of his thoughts, "about everything, about how much I've kept inside, how much I've tried to control, to manage, And how much it's cost me. Maria stepped closer, but still she didn't say anything. She didn't need to, she simply listened, as she always did. There was a quiet strength in her presence, a patience that Graham found both disarming and comforting. "I've spent so much time building this life," he continued, his voice faltering. "For a moment, I thought I was doing it for Sonia, for Maria, but I was really doing it for me, for my own need to feel safe, to feel like I could protect everyone from the world. But I can't do it anymore. I can't keep pretending that I have all the answers." Maria's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Graham saw something in her eyes, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone in this. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy. It was something deeper, something that said she understood him, understood what it was like to feel like you were always running, always hiding from something you couldn't face. "I don't have all the answers either," Maria said, her voice quiet but firm, "but I'm here, Graham. I'm here with you, and that's all I can offer. That's all any of us can give. We don't have to have it all figured out, we just have to keep showing up." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so long thinking that he had to have everything under control, that if he could just manage the details, manage the narrative, everything would be okay. But it wasn't about control, it was about trust. And for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to trust, not just her, but himself. "I'm not sure I know how to trust," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time guarding myself, keeping everything locked away, but it's not working. I've been living in a prison I built for myself." Maria nodded slowly, her expression understanding, but not without a hint of sadness. "It's not easy," she said softly. "But it's worth it. Trust is the foundation of everything. Without it, nothing else matters." Graham took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle inside him. For so long, he had believed that power, control, and wealth were the keys to everything. But now, standing here with her, he realized how little those things meant when compared to the things that truly mattered. Trust, love, connection. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I know I want to be here for it. For you, for Sonia." Maria's eyes softened as she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to rest lightly on his arm. "Then we'll take it one step at a time," she said, her voice steady, filled with the kind of quiet strength that had become her trademark. "One step at a time." Graham looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to keep his guard up, to protect himself from what might come. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what the future held for them. But in that moment he knew one thing for sure. Stood out, he was no longer afraid. Not of the world, not of the unknown, and not of Maria. Together, they could face whatever came their way. And that, Graham realized, was the beginning of something real. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, thick with the remnants of the storm that had raged through the night. Graham stood by the window in the kitchen, looking out at the damp garden, the leaves glistening with fresh rainwater. The world outside was quiet, as if it, too, was taking a deep breath after the chaos. It was a moment of peace, of stillness, and for the first time in what felt like years, Graham didn't feel the need to fill it with noise or worry. Sonia was in the kitchen, perched on a stool, her small hands reaching for the plate of muffins Maria had made. Her face lit up with excitement as she picked one up, breaking it into pieces with her tiny fingers, the crumbs falling onto the counter as she hummed a tune only she seemed to understand. Graham watched her for a moment, a soft smile tugging at his lips. There was a lightness in her now, something that had been missing before. She seemed content, secure. Maria walked in just then, her hair still damp from the shower, her eyes warm and steady as she approached the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but full of that quiet strength that had become so familiar to him. She looked at Graham, her gaze lingering for just a second longer than necessary, but not in a way that demanded anything. It was a look that simply acknowledged him, as though she understood the weight of everything that had been unsaid between them. "Good morning," Graham replied, his voice still thick with sleep, though something in it had changed. The tension that had been a constant companion for so long had begun to loosen. It wasn't gone, not yet, but it was no longer the thing that dictated his every move. Sonia, still absorbed in her muffin, suddenly looked up at Maria, her mouth full of crumbs. "Maria," she said between bites, her voice muffled but full of meaning, "you're my friend." Maria paused, her hand hovering just above the counter, as though she hadn't expected the words. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Graham felt the silence stretch between them, as if the entire room had stopped to listen. It was a simple thing, a child's innocent declaration, but it held more weight than anything he had heard in a long time. It was the kind of truth that cut through the clutter of life and went straight to the heart. "I'm your friend too, sweetheart," Maria said softly, her voice catching slightly. She smiled at Sonia, the kind of smile that was equal parts gentle and knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she finally realized what she had become to this little girl. Not just a caretaker, not just a stranger with a job, but something more, something real. Graham cleared his throat, a little embarrassed by the lump that had suddenly formed in his throat. He looked down at the counter, unable to meet Maria's eyes just then. But Maria didn't seem to need anything from him in that moment. She simply went about her tasks, preparing breakfast, her every movement calm and deliberate. She wasn't waiting for approval or validation. She wasn't seeking anything, she was simply there. And in that moment, Graham realized that was the key to everything, just being present. "Have you heard from the agency?" Graham asked, his voice steady now, though his mind was still lingering on what had just passed between them. Maria didn't look up at first, her hands busy with the task of setting the table, but there was a slight tightening of her jaw, a subtle shift in her expression that told Graham more than any words could. "They called yesterday," she said quietly. "They've been getting some complaints." Graham's heart sank at the words, though he couldn't quite place why. "Complaints?" he repeated, his voice sharp. Maria nodded, her eyes briefly meeting his. "Nothing concrete, just whispers. People think I've overstepped, that I've gotten too close." Graham's chest tightened. "What do they mean by that?" Maria paused, her hands still on the plate she had been setting down. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice steady but distant now. "It's not what they think, it's just gossip. They don't know what it's like, what it really means to be here, to care." Graham frowned, stepping toward her. "I'm not going to let them push you out, Maria. You're not just someone they can replace, not like they think you are." Maria's eyes softened at his words, though there was a sadness there, too. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm, the touch light but grounding. "It's not about them, Graham. It's about us, about what we're building here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her words, her calm assurance, settled something deep within him. He had been afraid of what people would say, of what they would think. But in that moment, as he stood beside her, he realized that their opinion didn't matter. They didn't define his life, his choices, or his family. "We're not perfect," Maria continued, her voice low and thoughtful, "but we're real." And that's all we need, Graham nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I'm with you. All the way. Maria's smile returned, soft and sure, and for a moment the world outside, with its noise and judgments, seemed far away. All that mattered was this quiet, this peace, this sense of belonging that had taken root in their lives, in this house, in this family. Sonia jumped down from her stool, holding her empty plate with both hands, looking up at them both with wide eyes. "Can we go outside today?" she asked eagerly. "I want to play in the garden with Maria." Graham chuckled, his heart light as he reached down to lift her into his arms. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go see the flowers." Maria followed them out the door, her steps sure, her presence a calm that seemed to weave its way through every corner of the house. And as they walked into the garden together, Graham couldn't help but feel something shift inside him, a quiet sense of peace, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, dark storm. They were no longer hiding, no longer running. They were simply living, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The garden outside was awash in the warm light of the morning sun, the soft rays filtering through the trees and casting dappled shadows across the stone path. It was a picture of calm, a scene that felt almost unreal in its beauty. The flowers, tulips, roses, daisies, stood proudly in their beds, their colors bright against the green grass. The air was filled with the scent of earth and blossoms, a simple reminder that life, in its purest form, continued to unfold. Graham stood at the edge of the garden, watching as Maria and Sonia knelt together beside the tulips, the little girl's hands moving carefully as she planted another bulb in the damp soil. Maria's gentle guidance made it look effortless, her movements soft but precise, as though she were teaching Sonia something far more important than how to garden. "Do you think they'll grow big?" Sonia asked, her voice filled with wonder, her small hands patting down the dirt carefully. "They'll grow as big as you let them," Maria answered, her voice light and full of that quiet confidence Graham had come to admire so deeply. "Just like you. All you have to do is believe that they can." Sonia beamed up at her, her face alight with excitement. "I believe," she said, as though the word were a magic spell. Graham smiled at the sight, his heart swelling with a warmth he hadn't known he could feel. Maria was doing more than just tending to the garden. She was tending to the child, to their family, in a way that he had never learned how to. Her presence was like water, steady and life-giving, creating space for growth in places that had long been neglected. He moved toward them, stepping carefully around the flower beds, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet soil. He knelt beside Sonia, his hand brushing lightly against the soft petals of the flowers. There was something grounding in the simple act of being here, in the garden with them. The weight of the past, the worry about the future seemed to slip away, like water flowing over a stone. "You're doing a good job, sweetheart," Graham said, his voice warm with affection as he placed a hand gently on Sonia's head. She grinned up at him, her cheeks flushed with pride. Maria watched the two of them, her expression thoughtful but serene. For a moment, Graham caught her eyes and saw something there, something that wasn't just about the work she did, or the care she gave, but something more. It was a kind of peace, a quiet knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be, that this was exactly where they all needed to be. "You've made this place feel alive again," Graham said softly, the words slipping out before he had fully thought them through. It was true, though. The house had never felt more like a home than it did now, not since Maria had passed. The silence had been replaced by laughter, the emptiness filled with moments like this. Small, simple, but profound in their quiet joy. Maria's eyes softened as she met his gaze, her lips curling into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I think it was always alive, Graham. It just needed someone to see it." Her words lingered in the air between them, and for a brief moment Graham felt a weight lift from his chest. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, trying to maintain an image of perfection, of stability. But Maria was showing him that there was more to life than that. There was beauty in the mess, in the quiet moments, in the things you couldn't predict. "We'll grow together," Graham said, his voice steady now, his hand resting on the soil beside him. "To all of us." Maria nodded, the expression on her face softening as she looked at him, at Sonia, at the life they were building together. There was no need for further words, no need for grand declarations. They both knew that what they had was something real, something that couldn't be measured by success or failure. It was something they had found in each other, something they had found in themselves. Sonia, her attention now fully on the flower she was planting, looked up at them with wide eyes. "Are we going to have a big garden?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "We'll have the biggest garden," Maria said, her voice full of promise. Graham chuckled, his heart light. "We'll need more flowers then." "We'll plant all the flowers," Maria replied, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Sonia's laugh rang out, a sound so pure and unburdened that it made Graham's chest tighten with emotion. The world outside may have been unpredictable, messy, but in this small corner of it, in the warmth of the sun and the quiet of the garden, they had found something that was truly theirs. Something that didn't need to be perfect, something that was already enough. As the afternoon wore on, the rain long gone, the garden seemed to stretch out before them, full of promise. Graham watched as Maria and Sonia worked side by side, planting the seeds of something new, something that would grow, not just in the soil, but in their hearts. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to rush, to control, to make things happen. He simply let the moment be, let the peace settle in, like the garden itself, as if it had always been waiting for them to notice. And in the distance, across the horizon, he saw the faint outline of a new day, a day that had yet to come but was already full of possibility. The following weeks drifted by in a rhythm that felt almost surreal, like the world outside had stopped moving, and only the small moments of their lives filled the space between breaths. Graham had begun to relax, though the tension that had lived inside him for so long never fully disappeared. It wasn't that he had solved everything, he knew he had, but the feeling that he was moving in the right direction, that they were all moving in the right direction, settled over him like a comforting blanket. Maria had become more than just a part of the house, she had become a part of him. And though he couldn't quite define what that meant yet, he knew it was something essential, something irreplaceable. She had taught him, not with words but with her quiet actions, that life wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up again and again, no matter the past or the doubts. She had shown him that strength could look like softness, and that vulnerability wasn't a weakness but a path toward connection. One morning, Graham stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, adjusting his tie. He was preparing for another board meeting, the kind that always left him feeling drained, like he had to prove himself to people who would never understand him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the weight of it, but it lingered. Even with all the changes, even with the clarity Maria had helped him find, the world outside still seemed to demand a version of him. He wasn't sure he wanted to give anymore. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Maria standing in the doorway. She was holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, her eyes soft and understanding as always. It wasn't just her presence anymore. It was the way she had come to know him, to know the things that weighed on him without him having to say a word. She simply knew. Long day ahead? She asked, her voice gentle, not probing, just offering. Graham sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The usual," he said, his voice heavy. "A lot of noise, a lot of expectations. I can't seem to shake it off sometimes." Maria stepped into the room, her presence filling it, calm and steady. She handed him the coffee, her fingers brushing his as he took it. There was no rush in her, no hurry to move him past his feelings. She was simply there, offering what she could, an anchor, a moment of peace. "Maybe it's not about shaking it off," she said quietly. "Maybe it's about letting the noise be there and still moving through it. You don't have to fight every battle, Graham. Some things just are." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment he felt the weight of his past, the expectations, the pressures slip a little. He didn't have to fix everything, didn't have to be the one who had all the answers. He just had to be, and that more than anything was what Maria had taught him. "You're right," he said, his voice soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "It's just hard to remember sometimes." Maria smiled, her eyes warm. "I know. But you're not alone anymore." The words settled into him, filling the spaces where fear and doubt had once lived. He wasn't alone. More. He had Maria, and in some strange, unspoken way, he had begun to understand what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. He didn't need to be the perfect father, the perfect man. He just needed to be present. "You've been more than just here for Sonia," he said, his voice low, vulnerable. "You've been here for me, too." Maria's smile widened, though there was a softness in her eyes that spoke of something deeper, something beyond words. "I'm not going anywhere, Graham," she said simply. "Not unless you want me to." He shook his head, the lump in his throat growing heavier. "I don't." And in that moment he knew, with an undeniable certainty, that the path he had been walking for so long, one of control, of fear, had come to an end. This new path, the one that Maria had quietly shown him, was one of trust, of vulnerability, of letting go. It was unfamiliar, but it felt like the only way forward. The sound of small feet echoed down the hallway, and before either of them could speak, Sonia appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and filled with that childlike curiosity that never seemed to fade. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "Maria, are we going to the park today?" Graham couldn't help but laugh, the sound warm and full of love. "I think that's the plan, sweetheart," he said, his heart swelling. "Let's get ready." As they left the room, Graham's thoughts drifted for just a moment. This was what life was now. This was what mattered. It wasn't the meetings, the expectations, or the pressures. It was this simple, beautiful life they were building together, step by step. And he was ready for whatever came next. The park was just a short drive away, but the car ride was filled with the sound of laughter. Sonia's, of course, and Maria's too. Graham found himself smiling, his heart light. He glanced at Maria, sitting beside him, her eyes focused on the road ahead, but her presence filling the car in a way that nothing else ever had. He didn't need to speak. He could feel the connection between them, something that was stronger than words. When they arrived at the park, the sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the grass. Sonia immediately bolted out of the car, her energy infectious. Graham and Maria watched her for a moment, both of them content in the shared silence. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that felt like everything was as it should. "I think she's finally found her place," Graham said quietly, his eyes following Sonia as she ran toward the swings. "She has," Maria replied, her voice soft but full of meaning, "and so have we." And for the first time Graham truly believed it. They had found their place. Not just in the world, but with each other. In the garden, in the house, in the quiet moments between the chaos. They had found peace, and they had found home. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm, a sense of calm that Graham had never known before. There were still meetings, still the demands of the world, outside the walls of the Watson estate. But they no longer held the same weight. Graham had found something that the world couldn't take away. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't status. It was something far more precious. Connection. Connection to his daughter, to Maria, and to himself in a way he had never allowed before. Maria had become not just a part of their household, but a part of his heart. It wasn't something he had expected, but it was something he had come to cherish. She was the anchor, steady and unyielding, in a world that had once felt like it was spinning out of control. And with her he had begun to realize that the life he had been living, the life he had thought was complete, was just the beginning. Sonia was thriving, her laughter now a constant presence in the house, her energy unrestrained. She had become the glue that held them all together. Graham watched her, with Maria by her side, and saw something in her that he hadn't seen before, a sense of joy, of security, that he hadn't even realized had been missing. One afternoon, after a quiet lunch, Graham found himself sitting in the study, his fingers idly tracing the edge of a book on the shelf. He was supposed to be working, but his mind kept drifting to Maria. The way she had become so much a part of this house, of their lives. The way she had slowly, without fanfare, woven herself into the fabric of their existence, making it stronger, richer, more real. He heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him, and before he could turn he knew who it was, Maria. He didn't need to see her to know she was there. Her presence had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. "You're thinking again," she said softly, her voice warm and steady. There was no judgment in her tone, just a quiet understanding. She had learned to recognize when he was lost in his thoughts, when the weight of the world outside threatened to pull him away from the peace they had found together. Graham chuckled softly, turning to look at her. "I guess I've been doing a lot of that lately." Maria smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with amusement. "You're allowed to think. Just don't forget to live while you're at it." He stood, walking over to where she stood by the door, the sunlight streaming through the window behind her, casting a soft glow on her. For a moment, Graham just looked at her, at the woman who had changed everything for him. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't some fairy tale ideal, she was real. And that, in a world filled with illusions, was more than enough. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Maria's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You would have found your way. You always do. But I'm glad I'm here." There was a pause, a long moment where neither of them spoke, where the silence between them was filled with everything that had been left unsaid over the years. Graham felt something inside him stir, something deep and raw. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to keep it all locked away. For the first time, he didn't feel the pressure of being perfect, of being the man everyone else thought he should be. He reached out, taking her hand in his fingers brushing against hers, the touch gentle but filled with meaning. "I'm still learning," he said softly, "but I'm not afraid anymore. Not with you here." Maria smiled, her gaze steady, her eyes filled with that quiet strength that had drawn him in from the very beginning. "You don't have to be perfect, Graham. You just have to be yourself. That's enough. That's always been enough." And in that moment, Graham understood. He didn't need to control everything. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be the perfect father, the perfect man. He just needed to be present, to show up, to be real. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead in a gesture that was simple but full of meaning. Maria didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She simply stood there, her hand still resting in his, the warmth of her presence grounding him, steadying him. "We're building something real, aren't we?" Graham murmured, his voice almost a whisper. Maria nodded, her smile soft but full of that quiet conviction he had come to trust. "We are." And in that moment, Graham realized something else. It wasn't about the house, the money, or the success. Warped. It was about what they were creating together. It was about the love they had found in each other, the connection that had begun to take root in their lives, right? And the quiet strength that came from simply being together. As they stood there in the quiet of the study, with the light from the window casting soft shadows on the floor, Graham knew that this was what mattered, this was what life was about. Not the noise, not the expectations, not the pressure to be someone he wasn't. It was about the small moments, the quiet love, the growth, the freedom to be imperfect. Later that afternoon, as the house grew quiet and the sun began to set, Graham found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sky change colors as the day slowly gave way to evening. Maria was inside, getting Sonia ready for bed. And for the first time in a long time, Graham felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because the world outside had stopped, but because he had finally learned how to let go. He closed his eyes, feeling the cool evening air on his skin, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush, to control, to figure it all out. He simply let the moment be. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. The days grew shorter, and the first hints of autumn arrived, bringing with it a chill that lingered in the evening air. The changing seasons mirrored the changes within the house, within Graham, within their lives. What had once been a place of silence and routine was now filled with warmth. Warmth of laughter, warmth of love, warmth that reached into every corner and into the very hearts of those who lived there. It was a warmth Graham never thought he would feel again. Yet, despite the peace that had taken root, there remained the ever-present weight of the outside world, the world that still watched, that still whispered, that still judged. It was a reality they couldn't entirely escape, no matter how much they wished for it. And while Graham had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, there was still the looming question of what it would cost him, what it would cost them, to live so openly. He had come to terms with the decisions he had made, with the new path he was walking. But there were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when he wondered if he had made a mistake. It was during those moments that he would find himself looking at Maria, seeing her there beside him, steady and unwavering. And in her presence he found the strength to silence the doubt, to silence the fear. She was the anchor. She always had been. One afternoon, Graham stood in his study. The city sprawled beneath him, as it always did, as if it were waiting for his next move. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his reverie. He glanced at the screen and saw the name. His mother. The familiar knot tightened in his stomach, but he didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone, his hand steady as he brought it to his ear. "Graham," Emilia's voice crackled through the line, as sharp and calculated as ever. "I'm not sure you've thought this through." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I've thought it through, Mother. I know exactly what I'm doing." Emilia's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. She was never one to mince words, but Graham could hear the disapproval in her stillness. She had always wanted him to follow a particular path, her path. the one that kept the world at bay, the one that never allowed for any deviation. It was a path he had followed for years, because he thought it was the only way. But now, as he stood on the threshold of something new, something real, he wasn't sure he could continue walking it. "You've exposed yourself," Amelia said finally, her voice cool but edged with concern. This woman, Maria, she's not the kind of person you can just bring into your life and expect everything to stay the same. She's not one of us, Graham. People are talking." "I don't care what people are saying," Graham replied, his voice firm, more firm than he had ever heard it before. "Maria is part of my life, part of this family, and I won't hide that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough for Graham to hear the sound of Amelia's controlled breath. "You're making a mistake, Graham. You're letting your personal life bleed into the business, into the legacy your father built. You know how the board will react." "I don't care about the board either," Graham said, his voice more resolute than ever. "This is about me, about us, about Sonia." Amelia's words came at him then, like the sharp edge of a blade. "You're throwing everything away for a woman who's nothing but a distraction. You've let her into your life, your heart, and now you're letting her take everything you've worked for." Graham felt his pulse quicken, but this time it wasn't with fear. It was with certainty. He had spent his life trying to live up to the expectations of others. He had been afraid of disappointing them, of failing them. But now, with Maria and Sonia, he saw that there was another way to live. A way that was quieter, gentler, but stronger than anything he had known. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said softly, but with an edge of finality. "I'm building something new. For Sonia. For Maria. For me." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Amelia's words had always held power over him, but now, for the first time, he felt as if he were standing on his own, grounded in a way he never had been before. "I'm not going to let you destroy this," he added, his voice steady. "This is my life, and I'm choosing it." And with that he ended the call, the click of the phone echoing in the quiet of the room. He sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle. It felt like a victory, but it was a strange one. The kind that left a bitter taste in his mouth, not because he was wrong, but because he was finally seeing the truth of what he had been avoiding all along. He had been living for others, and it had cost him. It had cost him his peace, his joy, his connection to what truly mattered. But now that was changing. Graham turned his gaze to the window, watching the city below. It was still the same city, still bustling, still full of noise and expectation, but it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't running from it. He wasn't hiding from it. He was standing firm in his own life, in his own choices. And that, he realized, was the most powerful thing he could do. The sound of small feet approached, and he turned to see Maria standing in the doorway, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at him, her eyes filled with the quiet understanding that had become her signature. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Graham smiled, the weight of everything lightening for the first time in days. "I am now," he said, stepping toward her. "I'm more than okay." She stepped into the room, her hand reaching for his. "Good," she said, her voice steady, and for the first time, it wasn't just about the battles they were fighting outside. It was about the peace they had found in each other. They didn't need to speak further. The silence between them was enough. Together they would face whatever came next, whatever challenges the world outside would throw at them. They had built something stronger than the noise. They had built something real. as they walked hand in hand toward the garden, toward the life they were creating. Graham realized that this was it, the beginning of something new, something that no one, not even his mother or the board, could take away. The days after the phone call with his mother were filled with an odd mixture of quiet and unease. It was as though, with one decision, Graham had irrevocably shifted the course of his life. And while he wasn't exactly sure what that meant yet, he knew one thing for certain: it was the right decision. Maria had become a steady presence, not just in the house, but in his life. She had begun to fill spaces he never knew were empty, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quietest, most powerful manner. Graham found himself looking at her differently now. Not as someone who had entered his life by accident, not just as a caretaker for Sonia, but as someone who had claimed her place, and in doing so she had taught him more about love, about what it meant to truly be seen, than anyone ever had. Maria had always been someone who moved through the world with such grace, such ease. It was as if she belonged everywhere, as though her presence could fill any void and bring warmth into even the coldest rooms. But for Graham, her place was no longer just where she worked. It was by his side, it was in their home. It was in the way she had quietly changed the course of their days. On a quiet evening, Graham found himself standing in the study again, his eyes scanning the city that sprawled beneath him. The weight of the world outside still hung heavy, but it no longer carried the same power over him. He had decided that he wouldn't run anymore. He had built walls brick by brick over the years to keep the world out. But now, with Maria beside him, he felt ready to tear them down. Not just for her, not just for Sonia, but for himself. The soft sound of footsteps in the hallway brought him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see Maria standing in the doorway, her figure framed by the soft light of the hallway behind her. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a softness that told him she had sensed the shift in him. She always did. "I've been thinking about something," Graham said, his voice low, almost hesitant. It was rare for him to allow himself to be vulnerable, especially in moments like these when the weight of everything pressed down. But with Maria it felt different. She had always allowed him to be himself, even when he didn't know who that was. Maria raised an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly as she stepped into the room, her presence filling it in a way that felt both grounding and exhilarating. "What's on your mind?" Graham hesitated, unsure how to put his thoughts into words. "I'm not sure what this all means yet, but I know it's the right path," Maria nodded, her gaze steady. She said nothing at first, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of understanding that reached deep into him. She didn't need him to explain everything, didn't need the certainty that he so often tried to force on the world around him. She understood that this was a process, a journey, not a destination, and she would be there as she always had been, standing by him, not to fix him, but to be with him. "I'm with you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wherever you go." The words hung between them like a promise, unspoken yet clear. And in that moment, Graham realized that Maria had always been with him, even before they had truly understood what that meant. Her presence in his life had never been an accident. It had always been a quiet certainty, even when he couldn't see it. "I've spent so much of my life trying to get everything right," Graham continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Trying to build this perfect image of success, of control, but now, I don't know. I don't want that anymore. I want something real, something I can hold on to." Maria stepped closer, her hand reaching out to him, her touch gentle but full of strength. "You already have it," she said softly. You just have to let it be." The words settled into him deep and true. He had spent so much time fighting against the world, against the expectations of others, that he had forgotten how to simply live, how to be. And Maria had shown him how to do that with her quiet strength, with her willingness to be herself, no matter what the world thought. Graham took her hand, holding it in his, grounding himself in the simple gesture. "I've been afraid, Maria," he admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "Afraid of what it would mean to truly let go, to stop controlling everything but you. You've made me realize that I don't have to fight all the time." Maria's smile was soft but full of meaning. She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with that quiet, unshakable strength. "You don't have to fight anymore. You never did," and in that moment Graham felt a shift, deep within him. The weight that had been so heavy on his shoulders for so long lightened, and for the first time he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He didn't need the approval of the board, the validation of his mother, or the recognition of anyone. He had found something more important than all of that. He had found peace. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, Graham looked at Maria, at Sonia, and felt the quiet joy of simply being with them. The world outside was still loud, still chaotic, but in this room, in this space, there was only love. There was only connection, and it was enough. Sonia, curled up on the rug with a book, looked up at them and smiled. "I like when we're all together," she said, her voice soft, filled with innocence. Graham looked at Maria, his heart swelling with love for the two of them. "Me too," he said, his voice steady now. "Me too." And in that moment, Graham knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges the world would throw at them, they would face it together. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was Maria, neither was Sonia. They were a family. And nothing, not even the noise of the world outside, could take that away. The days continued to pass in a quiet, unfolding rhythm, the type of pace that made everything feel like it was gently falling into place, piece by piece. Graham had found something in the days since that conversation in the study, a sense of peace, yes, but also a kind of resolve, the kind of resolve that comes when you stop fighting against the current and start moving with it. It wasn't that the challenges of his world had disappeared, the pressure of maintaining his business, the judgments of the outside world, the weight of family legacy. It was all still there, lurking in the corners. But somehow it didn't seem as important anymore, not with Maria by his side, not with Sonia's laughter ringing through the house. It was in these moments, the mundane moments of daily life, that Graham began to understand what Maria had meant when she said that healing wasn't about hiding. It was about returning to yourself, returning to the parts of yourself that had been buried under years of expectation, of fear, of pain. She had done that for him. She had helped him find his way back, not to who he had been before, but to who he could be now. Someone who wasn't defined by the world around him, but by the choices he made. And those choices, he realized, were the ones that mattered. Not the ones he had made for others, not the ones that had been expected of him, but the ones he had made for himself, for his family. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the garden, Graham sat on the porch with Maria, watching as Sonia ran around the yard, her tiny feet kicking up the earth in playful bursts. There was a contentment to the scene, a sense that this was what life had been meant to be. Simple, full of love, full of moments like this. Maria sat beside him, her eyes following Sonia's every movement, her expression soft. The two of them, Sonia and Maria, had become the center of his world, and he had never been more grateful for it. They had brought him back to himself in a way that nothing else ever could. "I think she's happy," Graham said softly, his voice almost reverent as he watched Sonia. Maria nodded, her eyes never leaving the little girl. "She is. She's found her place here, just like we have." Graham turned his gaze to Maria, his heart tightening with a mixture of love and awe. "And what about you? Have you found your place?" Maria looked at him then, her gaze steady and knowing. "I think I have," she said simply. "I think I've always known where I belong. It just took me a while to get here." The words hung in the air between them, quiet and meaningful. Graham didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the weight of her statement settle into him. There was so much more to Maria than he had first realized. So much strength, so much heart, so much history. She had come from a place of pain, of struggle, but now she stood beside him. "You're old." Not just as a part of their family, but as the cornerstone of it. She had given him something he didn't even know he needed. She had given him the courage to face his past, to let go of the things that had held him captive, and to embrace the future with open arms. And for the first time in his life, Graham understood what it meant to be truly free. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Graham said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "About not hiding anymore, about letting go." Maria turned to him, her expression soft but curious. "And?" Graham smiled, a small, quiet smile that was filled with more meaning than he had words to express. "And I think I'm ready. Ready to stop hiding, ready to let go of all the things that I thought defined me. I want to build something real, Maria, with you, with Sonia. I want to live my life on my terms." Maria's eyes softened as she looked at him, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "You already are," she said quietly. He chuckled, the sound light and full of relief. "I guess I've just been afraid of what it would cost me, what I would lose if I let go." "You haven't lost anything," Maria replied, her voice steady, full of that quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. "You've only gained a life that's yours, gained a family that's yours, gained peace." Graham nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking deep. He had spent so many years fighting, striving, trying to build a life that was perfect, that was accepted by everyone else. But now, in this moment, he understood that the life he had built with Maria and Sonia was the life that mattered. It wasn't about the world's approval. It wasn't about what others thought. It was about them, about what they had together, and that was enough. The evening stretched on, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. As the last light of day faded into twilight, Graham and Maria sat together in silence, watching Sonia run around the yard, her laughter ringing out in the evening air. For the first time in years, Graham didn't feel the need to rush, to push for more. He was content in this moment with what he had, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Graham reached over and took Maria's hand in his coat, his fingers curling around hers in a gesture that felt more intimate than any words could convey. There was no need for grand declarations now. They had built something real, something they didn't need to prove to anyone. They had each other. They had peace, and for the first time, Graham knew that he could finally let go of the past. He could finally live in the present without fear, without doubt. He was free. The days continued to pass in a blur of normalcy, a normalcy that, for Graham, felt more like a miracle than a mundane routine. It wasn't the kind of normal where everything was perfect, where nothing ever went wrong. It was the kind of normal that came with the deep satisfaction of knowing you were finally where you needed to be. It wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And for once, Graham felt like he was moving with it instead of against it. Sonia thrived. Her laughter, once a quiet thing, now echoed through the house with the freedom of a child who knew she was safe. She had found a rhythm, a sense of belonging, and every day she seemed to blossom more. The days spent at the park, the evenings tucked in close at the dinner table, the bedtime stories that ended in soft giggles, these were the moments that made the house feel alive, filled with warmth. Maria, too, had changed. She had become, in a way, the backbone of their lives. She wasn't just a part of the house anymore. She was part of Graham's heart, part of the quiet pulse that kept everything steady. There was no grand gesture, no great declaration of love or commitment. It was the subtle, everyday ways she showed up for him, for Sonia, for themselves. It was the way she had taken ownership of their lives in the gentlest of ways, making every moment more real, more lived in. One morning, as Graham walked downstairs into the kitchen, he found Maria standing at the counter, preparing breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, and he couldn't help but smile. He had never imagined that this was where his life would lead, that he would find peace in the most unexpected of places, in the most unexpected of ways. But here he was, standing in the kitchen of a house that now felt like home, with Maria at his side, cooking breakfast like they had been doing this forever. "You're up early," he said softly. Leaning against the door frame, Maria turned, offering him a small smile. "Someone has to make sure Sonia doesn't run off to the park without us," she teased, her voice light and warm. Graham chuckled and walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pressing his cheek to the top of her head. "You've made this place feel like a home," he murmured, his voice thick with gratitude. Maria leaned back into him, her body fitting against his, as if they had always been this way. "It's not just me, Graham," she said, her voice soft, but her words filled with a quiet strength. "It's us," he nodded, his chest swelling with the simple truth of her words. It wasn't just her. It wasn't just him, it was them, this life they had built together. This life that wasn't perfect, but was real. And in that realness, there was something more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Something more meaningful than any amount of wealth or status had ever given him. The days drifted by and life continued. The world outside didn't stop, of course. There were still the press stories, still the whispers, still the rumors that circulated about Graham's personal life, about Maria's place in it. But in the face of it all, Graham found himself no longer afraid. Maria's steady presence had given him something that nothing else could. It had given him the ability to see beyond the noise, to see the truth in his own life. A truth that he didn't need to explain himself to anyone. That his choices, his love, his family were his own. And that was enough. The still blooming foundation had become more than just an idea. It had grown into a movement, one that touched the lives of countless women who had struggled in silence, who had feared that they were too broken, too lost to ever find their way. But with Maria's strength, her story, they had found hope, they had found a community. And that, more than any success in the business world, was something that Graham would always cherish. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sky fade into hues of pink and orange, Graham looked over at Maria. She was staring out at the garden, a serene expression on her face. The same woman who had once walked away from a life she thought she could never return to. The same woman who had chosen to stay, not because she had to, but because she believed in something greater than herself. "Maria," he said quietly, his voice full of emotion, "I don't know what I did to deserve this." "To deserve you," Maria turned to him, her eyes soft but knowing. "You didn't do anything to deserve it, Graham," she said simply. "You just had to be open to it. To the love, to the possibility." He smiled, the weight of the years lifting from his shoulders. "And I'm open now, open to whatever comes next." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "We'll face it together." And they would. Whatever came next, they would face it as they always had. Side by side, building something real, something worth having. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, and Graham felt the peace of the moment settle over him, deep and unshakable. The noise of the world was still there, but it no longer mattered. They had built something stronger than the opinions of others, stronger than the judgments of a world that didn't understand. In the quiet, in the stillness, Graham found himself whole again. Not because he had everything he thought he wanted, but because he had everything that mattered. Maria, Sonia. The life they had built, not in the grand gestures, but in the small, everyday acts of love and commitment. And as the stars began to appear in the sky above, Graham whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else, "This is enough. This is everything." Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.